All right, real talk for a second. It's January, and somehow you already feel behind. You had good intentions, you had goals, you had momentum, or at least you thought you would. And now you're scrolling, listening, watching everyone talk about their big wins, their fresh start, their best year ever energy, while you're quietly thinking, why do I feel like I'm already playing catch up? Well, if that's you, I want you to hear this clearly before we go any further. Feeling behind in January does not mean you're failing as a leader. It usually means you care deeply about growth and you're holding yourself to a high standard. Today's episode is about grounding back into leadership when the year feels heavier than expected and how to recalibrate without spiraling, forcing, or quitting on yourself. Hey, dreamers, welcome back to your Dream Coach podcast. I'm Shayla Wey. I'm a small business coach, growth strategist, and believer that your dream life starts the moment you lead like you mean it. This podcast is all about leadership, fulfillment, and growth. And today we're talking about how to lead yourself well when things don't feel as maybe ahead of schedule as you hoped. And I want to jump into this because I had a moment probably week 2 in January, where I'm usually locked in with all of my goals and everything is mapped out. And I often find that there's so much natural pressure around the beginning of a year, and it can feel really heavy for leaders. And so I just found myself procrastinating on some of the things that really fire me up. And I had my overall goals and I started to do reflections over the previous year, but I hadn't gone as deep as I know I always love to. Then as I started reflecting, I realized that that's always sort of been a theme. Is I usually really like October, November, like to get a jump start on my overall goals and travels and vision for the year coming up. But in terms of that reflection piece, I find getting into December is really busy. I find the holidays, I want to just really be present. And even though I've tried many times to find a window in December to do a really solid reflection of 2025, I find that I just get a little stuck. And I feel like the more that I've journaled about this recently is that I feel like there's a natural pressure around it. And so I've always actually just found that mid-January mark, when you've got yourself back into routines after being out of a little bit of funk around the holiday season. I know that that's definitely where I find myself sometimes, that it's kind of a really lovely time to say, okay, we're a little bit into this new year. What even happened last year? Because I find the holidays and that whole season is such a big part of my highlights that I don't want to lose sight of that. And so, however that looks for you, my goal here today and why I wanted to bring this in is that January, like I shared, can feel really heavy for leaders because there's a lot of natural pressure I feel like we create for ourselves. And so I want to just jump in to share 5 things that I really want to normalize in what I've learned myself as a leader, and hopefully share with any of you that are just feeling a little bit behind. Is I have found that January isn't actually a fresh start for most leaders. It's honestly usually that transition month, because you're closing off the emotional weight of the previous year, which is what I was just sharing. Is there's always been something, around that time that I have not really been able to put my finger on. And that's really what it has been, is looking back, my reflection of the previous year often does happen mid-January. So I'm going to start to normalize that, is I'm going to just be present. And instead of feeling that guilt of I haven't done my reflections over the last year, which for some of you listening might seem silly, but I take so much pride in designing my life and my business by design, that taking that time to step back and reflect on what even happened the previous year, what were my magic moments, so that I can recreate what I loved so much, and also not just recreate, but also really plan for the things that I want to create. And so we're really entering into those routines again. We might even be finishing some of those goals off that maybe leaked into the beginning of a new year. We start to reassess expectations. And so mentally comparing where you are versus where you thought you'd be. I just even found this myself personally, is that tension can start to feel like that failure, when really it's just recalibration. And I love that word. Is as I was reflecting and as I've been working with leaders, even just these first few weeks of January, is that's really what I found a theme, is that we're just recalibrating. Because when you're a high driven, high achiever leader, CEO, you're naturally usually always a forward thinker. And so that's where I think sometimes that recalibration is such a great word to use, Because when we start to feel behind, we start to kind of can get a little frustrated. We might feel like we've missed our moments. And sometimes it really just means we're just getting into our new footing, which is totally normal in leadership. So, first thing that I want to share is that I really want to encourage you to separate behind from unclear, because most leaders who say they feel behind aren't actually behind. They're just unclear. And that's a huge difference. Behind feels like, well, I'm should be further along, or I'm late, or I'm not doing enough. That's oftentimes what I'll feel. And I've seen other leaders that I coach feel that same way. But unclear feels like I'm just not sure what matters most right now, right? We're recalibrating. We're just getting into the rhythm of what we are designing as a big year. Or we might feel unclear on everything feeling important, or I don't really know where to focus. So clarity really is calming. Busyness is not. So when you feel behind, it's often your leadership asking for direction, not pressure. So sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't move faster, it's pause long enough to decide what actually matters in this season. And that's leadership. The second thing is to stop comparing your January to someone else's highlight reel. This one is huge because what I found is comparison hits harder at the beginning of the year because everyone is sharing outcomes, not context. So you don't always see what they carried from last year, what systems they already had, what support they have, what season they're in. And leadership isn't about keeping pace with others. It's about staying aligned with your capacity, your values, and your vision. So when you compare timelines, you lose trust in yourself. And self-trust is foundational to leadership, fulfillment, and that sustainable growth. The third thing is to re-anchor in identity, not output. This one is one of the biggest mindset shifts that I coach around, because I found that when leaders feel behind, they start measuring themselves by output instead of identity. So they start saying things to themselves around, how much did I get done? How many wins do I have? Am I producing enough? But leadership isn't built on constant output. It's built on identity that is going to create the output. So when we ask ourselves questions like, who am I becoming this year? What kind of leader do I want to be under pressure? How do I show up when things feel slow? Growth isn't just about results. It's about who you become while building them. So when you reconnect to identity, urgency softens and intention returns. The fourth thing is redefine momentum, because it's not always loud. I had a really great coaching session with a client last week who brought that into the call, is that we're often wired to feel like more or the next level is growth. And sometimes growth can just be what I call inner peace, is we sometimes are at our best when we're maintaining for a period of time. And so because most leaders think momentum has to look forward focused or in forward motion that everyone can see, we sometimes can lose sight that sometimes the most important momentum happens quietly. It can happen internally before it even ever shows up on a scoreboard, and being okay with that. And momentum can look like maybe even rebuilding confidence after a tough season, clarifying what no longer fits in, stripping back some of those layers. Maybe it's cleaning up systems and working on the business. So things that are happening behind the scenes that aren't showing in results quite yet. Sometimes it's having hard conversations that you've been avoiding, or just even choosing rest or the power of a pause instead of forcing productivity. Now, there have been seasons definitely in my own leadership where from the outside, it looks like things slowed down, but internally, everything was just recalibrating. And so the truth is, most people don't say out loud, you can't scale momentum. You don't stabilize first. So January is often a foundation month, not a performance month. Now, it can be both, but if you're behind and you're feeling behind, then reframing this to be a foundational month to set yourself up strong can be a really great way to reframe how we're feeling. And so this does align with Brad Stulberg when he talks about in the practice, sustainable excellence comes from consistently and intentionally working towards our goals, right? Not constant intensity. And I think that's such a good reminder, especially with business owners that I work with, high level clients that have a lot on their plate, is that if you're doing the unseen work right now, you're not behind. You're just preparing. And the fifth thing is lead yourself with compassion before you lead others. This one matters more than people realize, is leaders who feel behind often become hardest on themselves. And that pressure eventually leaks into how they lead others. But leadership doesn't require harshness to be effective. It requires self-trust, emotional regulation. So when we ask ourselves, well, how would I speak to someone I deeply respect if they were in this season? What grace would I offer a team member who felt overwhelmed? And what would leadership look like if I led myself first? Because compassion doesn't lower standards. It creates emotional safety required to rise back into them. And research from Kristen Neff on self-compassion shows that people who practice it actually demonstrate higher resilience, not lower ambition. And strong leaders don't bully themselves into progress. They support themselves through it. So feeling behind is really a signal, not a verdict. And I want you to pause here for a minute, because I can tell if you're listening to this episode and you are taking time out of your day to listen to personal development, leadership, get yourself in that mindset, it's because you care. And feeling behind is usually information, not an identity. And it might be signaling that we just do need to get clear on our priorities. We've maybe outgrown last year's goals. Our capacity has shifted and expanded, and that we're just entering into a new season of leadership. And so you're asking bigger questions now, and that's not failure. That self-awareness of just knowing that we are in that recalibration, that foundational phase of the year, is leadership in and of itself. And that's evolution. Growth rarely feels linear. And if you've been in leadership for a while, you know that, especially at the beginning of a new chapter. So, grounding questions that I want to share with you for January in leadership is, instead of asking ourselves, why am I behind? Here are questions that I found far more powerful. What is actually required of me right now? Not eventually, like just right now. What do I need to focus on right now? What can I maybe release from last year that no longer fits? I know that I'm sometimes a victim of that, where I try to fill my plate and continue to add things and expand things without letting things go. And that's been really freeing going into this year with my expectations of what are my goals. I'm in a season of life where I value a lot of extra time with family right now. My kids are at a unique age. And so I've let some things go on a professional level. Not that doesn't mean that I'm not growing, but that I'm saying no to a few other things so that I can buy back some of that time while still growing and scaling a successful business. And then thinking about the leader that you want to be. I use the word often on this podcast and coaching client sessions, is how are we designing our life? What does that look like? And what would just be one aligned action that would restore trust with yourself this week? Leadership clarity doesn't come from that pressure. It's going to come from that presence. And so when we think about the core values that this podcast is built on around leadership, fulfillment, and growth, is I want to tie this into those pillars. The leadership core starts with self-leadership, which is probably why you're listening to this podcast, is that you know that you need to be listening to content that is going to ignite you and recalibrate you to have your leadership regulating your expectations and your energy, that your team feels more safer and more grounded as, you are interacting and leading them. The second pillar being fulfillment is, again, this always comes from alignment. And so when we kick off our year, January doesn't need to impress anyone. It needs to support you. And sometimes if we have had a bit of an off start, or we haven't felt as energized and we feel like, everyone else has got these big goals and I'm just feeling like I'm just getting into my rhythm, that's okay. That comes from that alignment, and that self-awareness is huge. And the third pillar is growth. And that growth that lasts is built slowly at first, and strong roots beat fast results every single time. So as I wrap up, I want you to hear this clearly, is that you're not late, you're not failing, and you are not behind in your becoming. You are in a moment of recalibration, and that's leadership. January does not require perfection. It requires presence. And just remember, as I always end off these episodes, is that your dream life starts with the way that you lead, the way that you live, and the way that you grow. So I will see you next time on your Dream Coach podcast. If this episode hit home and you're craving grounded leadership support, especially in seasons where motivation feels shaky, I'd love to invite you into the LFG Business Academy on School. It's completely free. And inside, you will also get access to the mini leadership series where we go deeper, leading yourself with clarity, building momentum without burnout, and growing in alignment with your values. And you can find that link in the show notes. We'll see you next time.